Good afternoon. It's 2 o'clock, March the 3rd, 2021 at the Environmental Education Center. We want to welcome you to our virtual field trip. The weather out here is gorgeous today. It is sunny, it is warm, it's supposed to get up to 70. And we started out this morning with the privilege of sitting there by the window, 3 of us, and watching about 4 or 5 deer play down by the pond. It's really great compared to what it was about a week or so ago. Again, thank you for joining us. If you are watching and you have not signed up, please do so. Go to www.tiny.cc/EEC register and sign up. This is just for our attendance records. Thank you. Today, we're going to do a program about evolution during this virtual field trip. Students will discover that evolutionary theory is a scientific explanation for the unity and diversity of life. Ms. Fuller is going to talk to you about common ancestry. Mr. Monroe will discuss natural selection. Natural selections and adaptations will be covered by Ms. Nash, and Ms. Ramirez will do a program called Genetic Drift. You cannot verbally talk to us during this program, but you can go to www.tiny.cc/EEC /question/answer and send in your questions. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And we're going to let Ms. Fuller tell us all about common ancestry.
Good morning. My name is Mrs. Fuller, and I'd like to introduce my lab assistant to you. This is Jiminy Cricket. I don't know if you can see him real well in there. Jiminy Cricket's going to help me talk about arthropods. Now, when you were in the 2nd grade, you learned that there were 4 different kinds of arthropods. You learned there were insects, arachnids, myriapods, and crustaceans, right? Well, I'm going to introduce you to a 5th kind of arthropod in just a minute. So let me share my screen with you so we can get on looking at that 5th group of arthropods. So the title of my program is How Common Ancestors Among Groups is provided, or common ancestry among groups is provided by the fossil record, biogeography, and homologies. So those are a bunch of big words. So we all have a common ancestor, LUCA, and LUCA stands for Last Universal Common Ancestor. LUCA looks very unimpressive. Its scientific name is Icaria wariusha. It's the oldest known bilateral and the oldest shared ancestor of all living animals. Now, bilateral means both sides. And these little guys had a head and a tail, and then they had a mirror image side. So it kind of looks like a pill bug. So the fossil record is most important for estimating when various organisms developed in geologic time. And the fossil record makes it possible to determine when traits appeared by examining a common ancestor. So these are trilobites. They were living on our planet for millions and millions of years, over 200 million years. And you can see that they changed quite a bit over the time. They start out very simple, very almost looking like LUCA, a head and a tail, and then the 2 sides that mirrored each other. And then it got a little fancier. And finally there toward the end, it looks like a bat's face on that one. So things, the fossil record helps us see how organisms have changed. And the fossil record is there all over the world. So we've got a good cross-section or example. Now, the father of biogeography is Alfred Russel Wallace. He was an Englishman who was born in Wales, and his father was a Wallace. And of course, they claimed heritage from William Wallace, Braveheart. So he was a very interesting person. He wasn't trained the same way a lot of scientists are. He was more of an autodidact, trained himself because he was very interested in a lot of different things. So what is biogeography? That's the study of the distribution of species and ecosystems in geologic space and geologic time. Now below you, you see Pangaea, right after it broke up. And these ideas of organisms living on multiple continents at the same time was proven by Alfred Wegener, that's the German scientist to your far right, that continental drift causes these different things to drift away from each other, but the fossil record is still there in the rocks. So if you'll look, South America is right up against Africa. A lot of you noticed that when you first started taking geography, when you were in elementary. Hey, South America looks like a puzzle piece against the puzzle piece of Africa. And you're right, it is. Now, Wegener was a brilliant scientist, and one of the things he did to prove or try to prove his idea of continental drift was to show similarities in fern fossils and also fossil in the form of coal in both America and in the UK. Now, what are homologies? Homologies are similarities of the structure, the physiology, the development of different species of organisms based on their descent from a common evolutionary ancestor. Now, these guys are all chordates. They all have backbones, but the same bone is represented in their legs. And I believe that's the radius. And you've got a human, a dog, a bird, and what I believe is a whale. And same bone in all of them. And they got it from an evolutionary ancestor. No one recent, a long time ago. Okay, now let's talk about an abrupt appearance and stasis in the fossil record. So we're going back to our trilobite because he makes such a good example. The trilobite is our fifth kind of arthropod. Now, at the very beginning, we talked about the insects and the spiders and the myriapods, et cetera, that you learned about in second grade. This is a fifth group of arthropods, but these guys are not ancestors to the four you already know about because something terrible happened to them at the end of the Permian. The trilobite is a good example to follow in the fossil record because it was present not only in the early Cambrian, but they think that they have found evidence in the pre-Cambrian rocks of a precursor or an ancestor to the trilobite. So it first shows up as a trilobite in 521. MYA stands for million years ago, through the third great extinction. Now, my slide says 90+% of the organisms on Earth were killed. They think it's closer to 98%. I mean, like, this was a devastating mass extinction. And this was at the end of the Permian period at 258 billion years ago. And that's the end of the trilobites. So they're in a very, I can't say narrow because it was really a long period of time, but you can see their evolution, their change over time in the bodies and the sizes of the trilobites. So you see on the left-hand side, fairly simple, in the middle, more complex, and then we've got a really fancy one over there on the right-hand side. So they showed up abruptly at the beginning of the Cambrian and disappeared instantly at the third great extinction. Now, they think the third great extinction might have had to do with global climate change. It might have gotten too cold or too hot, but it was devastating. I think it changed the chemistry on the planet, but it was quite remarkable how many it changed. Now I'm going to take my screen off and show you something I have here in my classroom. All right, there's a poster behind me. I can't bring it over because it's attached, but it talks about foraminifera. And there were tremendous amounts of foraminifera because they're extremely tiny, microscopic. And or a little bit bigger than microscopic, but pretty small. And their fossil evidence is in limestone all over the place. They're still alive today. However, there's a little chart right here, and you can see you've got a big broad band of foraminifera, and then they disappear 65 million years ago. Only 2 species survive. What happened 65 million years ago? Another great extinction. That's the one that killed all the dinosaurs. Well, everybody knows about the dinosaurs, but there are not as many dinosaur fossils left around the world as there are foraminifera. So we can study the extinct ones, we can study the ones that survived, only 2 species, and then all the ones that have evolved from those 2 species. So forams are an excellent way of plotting or seeing the trajectory of an organism and how it survived, how it met its decline and its extinction. And so it's a really interesting topic, and I recommend it to you. If you have any questions about this, Dr. Gorman would be glad to answer them. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Fuller. That's really interesting about our common ancestors. And I found a definition that shows that we all started out from this organism. Ms. Fuller showed you a picture of them. But let's see, an organism with 2 symmetrical sides. I think back, you have 2 sides, a distinct front and back end, head and tail, and a continuous gut connecting them. So that was our common ancestor. We all started out apparently from that little critter that she showed on her screen a while ago. And now Mr. Monroe is going to tell you about natural selection.
Good afternoon, students. My name is Mr. Monroe, and we're going to be investigating natural selection. You know, when we talk about natural selection, we realize through me looking up the data, we realize that natural selection can cause microevolution. We also realize that natural selection has several key points. One of the key points I did notice is fitness. And you know, when we talk about fitness, and as far as fitness being involved in organisms surviving, one might say only the strong can survive. Well, it doesn't have very much to do with that strong or that strength. What it does in natural selection to deal with, or has to deal with, is the ability of a species to reproduce and keep that species going. And we're going to look into that. So what I'm going to do at this point, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to go through a little PowerPoint that will help us to kind of understand what natural selection really is. Bear with me. Evolution and natural selection. Well, define evolution. These are the learning goals that we're going to go through. Defining evolution, the natural selection, describe 4 steps of natural selection, giving an example of each, explain the importance of variation. Number 4, how populations and species respond to the environmental changes. And number 5, list the 5 evidences that support the theory of evolution. Now, the latter one, we probably won't get to because my time with you is going to be very short. Evolution is the process of change over time, especially a change in the frequency of a gene or allele in a population over time. Charles Darwin is considered to be the father of evolution. He proposed a mechanism for evolution as being natural selection. Darwin went on a 5-year trip around the world on the ship, the HMS Beagle. As the ship's naturalist, he made observations of organisms in South America and the Galapagos Islands. He wrote a book called Origin of the Species. Darwin's finches. The shape of the beak is adapted to diet and environment of the finch. In the image here, we see that each finch ate a different diet, so they occupied a different niche and created. Natural selection is organisms that are best adapted to an environment. They survive and reproduce more than others. An adaptation is an inherited trait that increases an organism's chance in survival. It can be a behavioral adaptation, a physical adaptation, or a physiological trait that would be considered an adaptation. Darwin's theory of natural selection occurs in 4 steps: overproduction, variation, competition, and selection. In these images, we see several adaptations, and you guys are at the grade level now. You should be able to identify the adaptation that this organism has here, which is camouflage. This adaptation that this one has, it could be camouflage, or it could be the protective covering that that organism has. Overpopulation. Each species produces more offspring that can survive. For example, out here at the Environmental Ed Center, I know that in the spring, we're going to get the female aquatic turtles coming from our ponds that will nest and lay eggs. Once they lay their eggs, those females, those mothers, go back to the body of water that they came from. When those little eggs hatch into the baby turtles, there's enough of those baby turtles being born that I guess Mother Nature knows that some of them are going to be consumed and some of them will not be able to make that instinctive trip back to the pond. So there's an overpopulation or overproduction of species that will help that species continue. Variation. Each individual has a unique combination of inherited traits from their parents. I can think of one research that was done with beetles where there were brown beetles and green beetles. And it seems that over time, the brown beetles were able to survive and they became overpopulated because of their color, and that became a dominant trait. The green beetles did not really survive simply because birds that consumed them for food were able to find them very easily because of their colorization. Why is variation important? Because the environment changes. We live in a changing world. The more variations within a species, the more likely it will survive. If everyone is the same, they all are vulnerable to the same environmental changes or diseases. The more variation of types of species in a habitat, the more likely at least some will survive. An example is dinosaurs were replaced by mammals. Which community has a better chance of surviving a natural disaster? Well, we look here, there's not very many organisms, right? We come over to this image here, and there is a variety, there's a diversity. So I would say community A. Competition. Individuals compete for limited resources such as food, water, space, and mates. Natural selection occurs through survival of the fittest. And when we talk about fitness, that is the ability to survive and reproduce, keep that same species going. Not all individuals survive to adulthood. Selection. The individuals with the best traits, the adaptations, will survive and have the opportunity to pass on its traits to its offspring. Natural selection acts on a phenotype appearance, not the genotype genetic makeup. When a predator finds its prey, it's due to the prey's physical characteristics like color, slow speed, and not the alleles like B and B and B and small b. Individuals with traits that are not well suited to their environment either die or leave few offsprings that will eventually die. Evolution occurs when good traits build up in a population over many generations and bad traits are eliminated by the death of the individuals. Adaptations. And at this point, I'm going to stop because I believe somebody else is going to be picking up that topic for you in our session today. But I want to remind you that organisms will heritable or genetically determined features that help them survive and reproduce in a particular environment tend to leave more offsprings than their peers. Also, if this continues over generations, the heritable features and that aid survival and reproduction will become more and more common in that population. The population will not only evolve, changed in its genetic makeup and inherited traits, but will evolve in such a way that it will become adapted or better suited for its environment. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And I'm going to give it back to Dr. Gorman. So if any of you have any questions, he might be able to answer those questions for you.
Thank you, Mr. Monroe. The question is, give us a couple more examples of adaptations. And one of them is the long necks of giraffes in Africa. They prefer a certain type of leaf, and other smaller animals eat all the leaves down lower. So the giraffes have a long neck, they can reach up and eat the leaves that they want. Now, if their neck's not long enough and they can't reach those leaves, they're probably not going to make it around very much longer. Okay, and another example is there's a habitat where there are red bugs and there are green bugs. The birds prefer the taste of the red bugs. So soon there are many green bugs left and very few red bugs. The green bugs reproduce and make more green bugs, and eventually there are no more red bugs. So that's the time when you'd want to be a green bug and not a red bug. And now Ms. Nash is going to tell you about natural selection and adaptations. Ms. Nash.
Hello, welcome to my classroom. I have something amazing here. What do you think that is? Anybody want to guess? The teeth are missing. It's the skull of a dolphin. And if it had teeth, it's one of the toothed whales. There are like 66 species of toothed whales, and 10 are debating. And the other amazing thing about this, besides that big brain there, is right here. That's the nostrils. Okay. The nostrils. Okay. The eyes are right here on the side of the head. The nostrils are up here on the top of the head. How did that happen? It's amazing. Let's look at the evolutionary history of whales, and then we're going to think about, compare them to another couple of groups. Okay, one of which is anciently, distantly related, and the other isn't, but it looks like it might be. So the first thing we notice about this evogram, this evolutionary chart, is that hippos are the closest living relatives to whales, but they're not their ancestors. Okay, so what this means is that over here they had a common ancestor, and then those two diverged, and then hippos along line intermediate forms that are not included in this diagram. Okay, so that's about 60 million years ago, a long time ago. And the hippopotamus is the closest living relative. So the ancestors of today's whales were four-legged, land-dwelling creatures, probably omnivores or little carnivores, who gradually were living on the edge of the sea, the ocean, and gradually became more and more aquatic. The feet, the legs disappeared, and finally they've become today's whales. Okay. And you can see they have this little remnant pelvis and hind limbs finally disappear completely. The legs get shorter and shorter, they become webbed feet, and then finally they lose their feet and use their tail to swim. These are some drawings of those ancient forms, okay? See, they're hunting there, they've got fur, okay? The ancient forms had fur, they've got nostrils right here, okay? They're hunting in the water, they're swimming in the water, eating fish. Their legs begin to get smaller and smaller, and they become more fully aquatic. You notice that the nostrils are moving. So the nostrils are no longer here, they're moving up to the top of the head. Okay? And finally, the legs are gone, and they begin to have a dorsal fin, okay, to help them with swimming. So today we have our two big, there's a lot of kinds of whales, and we can think like, why are there so many different kinds? And of course, one reason is that since oceans cover the majority of our planet, 75% of our planet is ocean, it's a big space to live. If you can live in the ocean, you got lots of space. And there's lots of different kinds of other animals. If you're a predator like these guys, there's lots of different prey species out there that you can exploit, and lots of different kind of micro habitats. The other kind of amazing adaptation are the giants, okay? The biggest animals that ever live on our planet, the blue whale, okay? Bigger than any dinosaur, giant, enormous. These are the filter feeders. So we got a bowhead here, bowheads, and these are the humpbacks with the long, long front flukes. So they still have their bones inside the front flippers, like Mrs. Fuller showed you, the remnant of that, the TV, I can't remember. But these guys, they don't have teeth anymore. So on the top of the jaw, they have baleen, which is a kind of keratin. And they think that evolved from little serrated teeth to begin filtering out small things. So they eat plankton, tiny, tiny creatures, and also small fish. Now, there's another group of animals that are really interesting, and you look at them and you think, oh, that's a kind of whale. But in fact, it's not. You may have seen these. They live in Florida. The sea cow, poor things are terribly endangered, sea cows. And then these are the dugongs, and they kind of, look at the funny mouth, okay? They get things up off the bottom. These are herbivores. They eat plants, and they're all herbivores. There's an extinct form. This one here, this giant one called stellar sea cow. And they lived up in the Arctic. And sadly, when people got up there, they killed and ate them. They were hunted to extinction, but they were enormous. But again, they've undergone that same kind of change. They've got their front legs are here. They've even got little fingernails on their front legs, but their back legs are gone, and they've got a tail fruit for swimming, okay? And their nostrils are kind of up on top here for this one, but they're not diverse. There are about 3 kinds of sea cows. They all live in tropical waters. These live in Indian Ocean. So they were all vegetarians. The stellar sea cow ate kelp, and the giant kelp forests on the West Coast. But these are the only 4 surviving members. So they did not have as much species diversity. So probably one reason is that they a limited diet. So they all had to live close to shore, because that's the only place that ocean plants really grow, because plants need sunlight. So you have a limited area that you can live in, and you're also very slow and easily hunted, sadly. Here's our hippos. Again, weird to think about. They're now also become aquatic. So they all lost their fur. They don't have any fur anymore. They've got fat, okay, to keep them warm. Although these guys live in tropical areas, so they don't need insulation. there are only 2 species of hippos today. And again, probably because their habitats are limited. They need to be able to eat tremendous amounts of vegetation and be in water because they sunburn badly, and they're tremendous weight. They have to be in the water. Okay. But they swim rather well, and they kind of can walk on the surface. Notice that the nostrils are up here to get a breath of air, and the eyes are on top. Look at the pygmy hippo. They're about half as high and a quarter as heavy. Okay, they've got longer legs and they hang out in the forest more. And again, they don't have web feet like the common hippo, but they are pretty good swimmers. Okay. So the interesting thing to me is to think about why there's so much diversity in the whales. They range from gigantic ones to ones that like the vaquita. They're in the Gulf of California. Okay, it's like 5 feet long. Okay, there's some that live in the Amazon River, the River Amazon. Some live in freshwater. Some of the smaller dolphins. Okay. Most of them now live in the ocean, and because they eat such a wide variety of food, they've been able to exploit all the different habitats. Okay. So really amazing mammals. Okay, they reproduce underwater. Here's a mama with her baby. They reproduce very slowly. They do live a long time. They say that the bowhead whales, like that one there, can live for 200 years. Okay. Sadly, they've all been hunted, and there's lots of problems with sonar and entrapment and nets and things. So we're not doing them very good favor. But they are a really interesting group to learn about. And in particular, their evolutionary history is just fascinating. So if you have any questions about whales, you can ask Dr. Gorman.
Well, the question that came in was about adaptations. And it asked about an unusual adaptation. And so I thought that was interesting. So what I came up with is an adaptation to catch prey. And I was surprised when I found the answer that they gave in the book. It is the king snake. And I did not know this, but a king snake is immune to snake venom. It can eat diamondback rattlesnakes or eat water moccasins, and it won't hurt it at all if they bite it. And I thought that was very unusual adaptation. And now we're going to have Ms. Ramirez tell us about genetic drift.
Hello, my name is Ms. Ramirez, and in this segment, we're going to be learning about genetic drift. So I'm going to go ahead and share our presentation with you guys, and we'll get started. Might take me just a second to pull that back up. So let me move some stuff off my desktop. So we're going to be talking about different evolutionary mechanisms. And my essential questions for you guys throughout this segment, I have 3 questions. So keep these 3 questions in mind as you listen to this segment. The first one is, what is gene flow? The second question is, what is genetic drift? And the third question is, what is the difference between bottleneck and the founder effect? So we're going to go over those 3 questions throughout this presentation. So the first thing we're going to talk about, take a look at this little visual there. What do you think that visual is trying to tell us? So what we're going to first start off talking about is gene flow. And essentially gene flow is just the exchange of genes between 2 populations. So take a look at this diagram. We have on the left, this population of kind of like gray and blue birds. And then on the right, across the river, we have a population of kind of like gray and pink birds. And we can tell that gene flow is occurring in this population between these 2 populations because we have one of the birds flying over. So essentially the movement of alleles from one population to another is gene flow. So super simple. So for many individuals, gene flow occurs when individuals move between populations. So for example, when people are moving from one city to a new city, or even from one country to another country, that is increasing gene flow. And then gene flow increases the genetic variation of the receiving population. So if that bird comes over here to this population and mates and has offspring, then this population on the right will have new genetic variability. It'll now have the alleles of the lowercase AA. Now, my question for you guys is, what will happen if gene flow between two populations stops? So what do you think would happen in that scenario? And then our next thing that we're going to look at is genetic drift. And genetic drift is essentially a change in allele frequencies due to chance. And smaller populations are more likely to be affected by chance. And so a couple of questions I had for you guys is, do you think genetic drift is more likely to happen quickly on an island or on a mainland, and then why? And then, as we discussed earlier, smaller populations are more prone to genetic drift, and why do you think that is? And then there are two processes that commonly cause populations to become small enough for genetic drift to occur. So the first process that we're going to talk about is the bottleneck effect. And it occurs after an event greatly reduces the size of a population. So the number one example that people typically think of are the South African cheetahs. So the exact cause of this bottleneck is unknown, but scientists think that since the last ice age 10,000 years ago, that is what ultimately led to the extremely low genetic variability between the cheetahs. And then, of course, nowadays they're endangered because of poaching or illegal hunting, and also habitat loss is a big problem. So the cheetahs are facing a huge dilemma. They don't have a lot of genetic variability, and the lower population's genetic variability, it has a harder time adapting to new environments. And so something that the zoos and aquariums are doing, they have what's called a species survival plan. So if you ever go to the Dallas Zoo or the aquarium and you see the words SSP with a little rhino icon, that means that that animal is part of the species survival program. And essentially what it is, the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, they have like breeding programs. So they actually have genetic test results on all the animals in the zoos, and they pick the best female and male to mate to increase their odds of having a varied genetic diversity. So they have to have permission to breed certain animals, and they're kind of like a date match for animals, if you will. And so unfortunately, in the 1980s, there were over 25,000 cheetahs, but today there are currently less than 7,000. So their numbers are dwindling. And again, that's habitat loss, poaching, and human-wildlife conflicts. And because of that, again, that would be an example of what would happen with our bottleneck. The other process that would lead to genetic drift is the founder effect. And the founder effect is a genetic drift that occurs after a small number of individuals colonize a new area. So for example, take a look at this diagram here. We have a circle, and that represents a population, and the little colors and shapes that you see represent different alleles, the genetic diversity. And so this is the original founding population. Now let's say a few individuals from this first population decide to move away and colonize to create their own smaller population. And that's what we see happening here in these three smaller circles. So in this diagram, we see that just by chance, here in this circle, the five people that migrated to create their new colony, just by chance, those 5 people happen to have the same genetic gene, so they're all red. And then in this new sub colony, they have the blue and red, so those represent different alleles. And then just by chance, this little colony, they happen to have all the same similar genes as well. And so, and a real life example of this is the Old Order Amish community of Pennsylvania. So they were founded a long time ago. They were immigrants that came to North America, and they were originally from Europe. So the Amish of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, they actually have a high rate of a syndrome called Ellis Van Creveld syndrome. And it's rare, but this Amish community has a super high occurrence of this syndrome because when they left their original colony, it just so happened that a lot of the founding members had that syndrome, and it was consequently passed down. So because the Amish community has a tendency to stay in that community for the rest of their life, they often will marry within that community. And so there's not a lot of genetic diversity. And so they can actually trace back the syndrome to the founding couple that created that community. So that's pretty interesting. So just know that genetic drift that occurs after a small number of individuals colonize a new area is the founder effect. And that was a real life example with the Amish community from Pennsylvania. So I'm going to go ahead and stop our screen share. And then I have just a little example of the bottleneck effect. So here I have a water bottle that I filled with different colored beads, and the beads represent different alleles. And again, just for the genetic diversity, we have different, look at the different colors that we have in here. And then I'm going to dump some of the beads into this beaker, and that's going to represent the bottleneck effect, where we had maybe an extreme situation where some of the genes were lost. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to dump it. Notice that at a certain point, the beads stop coming out. So that represents an extreme situation that would cause the genetic drift to occur. But now look at the new genes in our new gene pool. So notice the difference in, again, the beads are going to represent the alleles. So notice the difference in the alleles present in our new population. So here's the original population. We had different colored beads of red and purple and yellow and pink and orange. So a very good variety in our gene pool in the original population. Then we had a bottleneck. We had something terrible happen to this population. Maybe there was a forest fire and 80% of the individuals there died. And then, so this is what is left. And so now look at what's left in our new population. Is it as genetically diverse as the original population? So no. So you can see that this new population has fewer genetic diversity. It actually lost some alleles. So notice that we no longer have the pink allele in there. We no longer have the blue allele in there. And we mostly have our greens. So this, if they do start to reproduce again, that green allele is going to become very dominant compared to the other ones. So that's an example of the bottleneck effect. You can do something similar at home, and you can do it several times to see what your results would be and how it would affect the genetic variation of subsequent populations. And that's all I have for you guys today on gene flow and genetic drift. And we're going to give it back to Dr. Gorman, and he's going to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Maris. And the question came in, is there an example that's a little closer to home? And yes, the American bison is an example. I'm going to read it to you. The American bison was hunted to near extinction. And even today, as the population has recovered, the result is a population of bison with little genetic variation. They all look alike. Think about it. If you go down the road and you see a pasture full of cows, there's probably going to be black cows and white cows and red and white cows and big cows and little cows, and some have horns and some don't. Or you can look at horses. The big old plow horses like the Budweiser horses, or little slick, fast horses like thoroughbreds or race horses. But look at buffalo. They all look the same. Now, some of them are bigger than the others. The big old males are bigger than the females, but they all have horns. They're all brown. They all have those shaggy coats. So that's an example of right here. The buffalo was hunted, or buffalo or bison are the same thing, was hunted to near extinction, but they were brought back. But they all look alike now. Okay, now I am going to share my screen. This always takes a minute. During this virtual field trip, students discovered that evolutionary theory is a scientific explanation for the unity and diversity of life. Ms. Fuller covered common ancestry. Mr. Monroe, natural selection. Ms. Nash, natural selection and adaptations. and Genetic Drift by Ms. Ramirez. Thank you. How did we do? If you will go to www.tiny.cc/EEC feedback, fill out the short form and send it in, we would appreciate it. You guys have a great day, but most of all, you students and teachers, have a great rest of your life. Thank you and come back.